Good morning and welcome to another video cast by Hendy Consulting, the specialist management consulting firm to the $125 billion FPD industry. And today we've actually only got a single slide and we want to talk about issues arising around fab modelling for new investments into novel or existing display technologies and the things that you should think about. Now this is a smaller subset of a bigger deck that I also posted about a month ago on investments into the display arena in general, but now we're going to talk very specifically about some of the modelling issues that you might get involved in if you were thinking about putting together a reasonable plan for a new factory somewhere in the world to cope with either a current or a novel display technology. So the first one, and this is our framework for thinking about the different elements of the model. The first thing always that people focus on is how much is the capex going to be, and I have to say here in terms of execution, it's the OPEX and the material costs that will kill you in execution. So actually anybody thinking about this should worry just as much about supply chains for materials and support for equipment in unusual places as they should do thinking about the total capex. But let's start with capex. Capex, we've got discussions on the risks and benefits of second-hand versus new equipment. There's always quite a range of industrial strategies that are on the table and potentially combination models and also incremental models over time that maybe start with module assembly and then build towards a full factory with an array process later. So under the discussion of capex, there's actually quite some work on thinking about what the industrial strategy might be, considering equipment and other risks associated with that, but then the trade-off with economic value and who is going to support the capex once you have it. So I think overall people tend to emphasize capex too much when actually the bulk of the effort should go into thinking about material costs but also product mix. So moving on then, I mean, of course, if you're in material cost, there's a number of times when there are process trade-offs, for example, inkjet printed or coated, if you're talking about some novel OLED or QDEL material, when usage and wastage comes into it, material supply chains and any tariffs or off mainstream supply route pricing issues. So, for example, you want to put a factory down in the USA, well, borosilicate glass, as far as I know, is not available in the US, and so I'm not sure who Depix uses, but that's the only display fab of any reasonable size in the US, and so you have to think very materially about how your links to material suppliers are set up in advance. That's just as important as the capex itself. I'm talking here across the top. Then the other one that's really important in putting together a factory planning process is thinking very much about the target applications, target price points, technology positioning of the products and the product mix that you're going to sell. And I think I've made the point previously on other video casts that mix is actually the primary driver. If you want to haul an NPV into the positive territory, then one of the things you can easily do is just increase the portion of premium mix, but then any investor looking at such a plan should start there by looking first. So pricing and mix end up having a disproportionate impact on an NPV if you make sort of reasonable, realistic assumptions on operational metrics such as yield. Also in here now I've got some discussion of cell and module labour costs and overheads, and some of these also play into back-end and module strategies and where you want to choose to have those, and do you want to do those in a low-cost region, because there's actually, the human eye is amazingly sensitive at testing displays, and so module assembly often is done with a fairly large workforce in a low-cost environment. Already China is becoming less competitive in such, and people are moving such module assemblies to places like Vietnam or others, but I mean bifurcating your investment strategy to thinking a little bit also about array and cell process separated from module is important. Clearly, most people, when they're thinking about a factory investment, tend to focus on the tax and R&D credits and subsidies that they might get, and yes, those are important, but again, my emphasis through this is to say it's OPEX that will kill you, and perfect execution plus the material cost by being on supply lanes or having cut specific deals with the key material suppliers is more important, I would argue, in terms of being able long term to compete. Of course, in any sort of project finance like this, you start getting into perpetuity value, reinvestment rates for asset life, and other implications, plus the working capital impact of ramp up, which is not immaterial, plus a discussion on the discount rate. So, I mean, any of those, certainly the asset life and perpetuity value thing is something that we've covered many previous times. And then within the generalist understanding of this is thinking about the business risks, and those business risks are incumbent based on the industrial strategy, but also the material supply strategy, the product strategy, and having customers lined up already, and a view you might take on pricing. So I guess if I had to summarize out of all of this in terms of thinking through, if you wanted to put a fab down somewhere, I would just say balance any thinking that you have on material and material supply routes, OPEX in general, and as part of that, of course, you need high yield to get there. So perfect execution in OPEX exposure is just as important as getting the upfront industrial strategy and the CapEx right. And within that, then product positioning and pricing and mix end up being key levers. Anyway, I thought that would be an interesting overview for people thinking about new factories, novel technologies, and ways to play with new investments in the display space.